The unbeatable empire. The galaxy had long accepted one truth. The Zorathian Empire could not be defeated. For centuries their fleets had carved across the stars, crushing rivals and bending entire civilizations into submission. They stood tall in their arrogance, their banners draped across conquered worlds, their admirals speaking as though they commanded not only ships, but destiny itself. Every species whispered of their strength. They had never lost a war. Even their enemies began to believe the myth that the Zorathians were untouchable. On the edge of known space, a small rebel world named Karanos was about to be the next example. The Zorathian flagship, an enormous vessel bristling with weapons, floated above the planet like a shadow of doom. Squadrons of cruisers and destroyers spread out in formation, their guns aimed at the surface. On the ground, civilians huddled in shelters, their faces pale and tired. They had seen what came before: the burning of cities, the shattering of fleets, the chains of empire, and they knew resistance was hopeless. Inside the rebel command bunker, the last council sat in silence. Maps glowed on their displays, red, lines showing enemy advances. Their fleet was already gone, torn apart in the outer system. All they had left were a few defense batteries and stubborn will. General Arvak, an old warrior with scars across his face, leaned forward on the table. "We have done all we can," he said. His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed despair. The others nodded. They knew the truth. This would be the end of Karanos. High above, in the vast command deck of the Zorathian flagship, Admiral Klyros observed the planet with cold amusement. His talons tapped against the armrest of his chair as he watched the holographic display. "Another world to bow," he said. Officers around him nodded quickly. He had no fear. Why should he? The Zorathian fleet had never met a foe they could not overwhelm. Today would be no different. But then the sensors flared. A ripple appeared on the edge of the system near the moon. The technicians frowned, uncertain. The admiral's crest lifted in annoyance. "What is that echo?" he demanded. The sensor chief hesitated, then answered. "A ship, Admiral. One ship. It has just broken stealth near the moon." On the screen, a shape emerged. It was massive, armored in dark plates that reflected little light. Its design was strange, not like any known Empire craft. It carried scars across its hull as if it had seen wars long past. At first the officers scoffed. One ship against a fleet of hundreds, it was laughable. But as the image grew clearer, a whisper spread. The markings, the old design, the human crest painted in stark white against the black hull. The word passed between officers with unease. Terran. The rebels in their bunker saw the same signal. At first they did not believe it. Humanity was a rumor, a forgotten race from old stories said to have vanished from the galactic stage generations ago. Some claimed they had destroyed themselves. Others said they had fled beyond the rim. But here, before their eyes, a Terran battleship appeared. Sliding into orbit like a ghost returned. The Zorathian admiral laughed, a harsh grating sound. "One Terran relic dares to face me," he said. "We will crush it as we have crushed all others." He signaled for his gunners to prepare. But then the speakers crackled across every channel, a voice steady and calm. It spoke in clear standard, words heavy with authority. "This is the Terran dreadnought Valiant. Cease fire on this world. Withdraw now. You will not fire another shot." The rebels froze. The civilians listening on their radios gasped. Even the Zorathians went silent. The voice carried no bluster, only certainty, like a teacher warning unruly students. For the first time in centuries, the Zorathian fleet hesitated. Admiral Klyros narrowed his eyes and leaned closer to the screen. He studied the human ship, its dark hull, its calm posture in the face of overwhelming numbers. A flicker of unease touched him, quickly buried under pride. He raised his hand. "Send them a warning volley," he ordered. "Let them know who rules this galaxy." Cannons flared from the Zorathian cruisers. Beams of energy streaked across space, slamming into the void around the Terran ship. Fire and light filled the darkness. The rebel commanders covered their faces, certain it was over before it had begun. But when the light faded, the Terran dreadnought still drifted calmly, its shields glowing faintly. It had not moved. The voice returned, calm, steady, unshaken. "You have fired your warning. Now hear ours. Stand down." The bridge of the rebel bunker filled with stunned silence. For the first time since the war began, their despair cracked. A small ember of hope flickered to life. A single Terran battleship had come, and the unbreakable Zorathian Empire had just been challenged. First exchange of fire. The Zorathian fleet had never been questioned, never been forced to pause before unleashing destruction. Yet now hesitation rippled across their lines as the Terran dreadnought stood unflinching before them. Admiral Klyros felt the eyes of his officers upon him, and pride forced his hand. He could not allow fear to spread, for the myth of Zorathian invincibility was their greatest weapon. He ordered the flagship to target the human vessel directly and unleashed another strike, this time with heavier firepower meant to test the strange armor. Brilliant lances of plasma and kinetic rounds filled the void, converging on the solitary ship. For a heartbeat, it seemed certain that no vessel could withstand such force, but then the Terran dreadnought moved. It was not a desperate scramble or a sluggish evasion. It glided with measured precision, its thrusters burning pale blue as though it had anticipated every shot before it was fired. Energy washed across its shields, flaring but holding. The rebel commanders, watching from their underground screens, leaned forward, their despair breaking further. Then came the reply. The dreadnought's forward cannon activated with a low hum that vibrated across sensor nets. A single shot of concentrated kinetic energy roared from its barrel, tearing through space with unimaginable velocity. It struck a Zorathian cruiser broadside. The alien ship split in two as though sliced by a god's blade, its pieces tumbling apart in silence. Shock spread through the fleet. The Zorathians had lost ships before, yes, but never with such ease, never with such merciless precision delivered. In one cold strike, the rebel bunkers erupted with cheers that quickly turned into choked sobs. They had just witnessed what they believed to be impossible. One human ship had cut down a cruiser like paper. Civilians on the surface who had been prepared for death now raised their eyes to the sky, whispering that maybe, just maybe, salvation had come. On the flagship bridge, Admiral Klyros slammed a fist against his command chair, his crest flattened in anger. "One cruiser is nothing," he growled. "They rely on tricks and ancient weapons. We will bury them under fire." He ordered the fleet to full engagement. Hundreds of fighters launched, filling the void with wings of silver and black, their weapons primed to swarm the Terran vessel. Missile salvos shot forth from destroyers, bright tails streaking across the darkness, converging on the dreadnought like a storm of vengeance. For a moment, the dreadnought seemed lost in the swarm. Explosions flashed as missiles approached, and Zorathian pilots howled victory cries over open channels. Yet the dreadnought's defense grid came alive. Turrets rotated in seamless rhythm, streams of light lanced outward, shredding missiles, one by one. Automated cannons tracked fighters with unnatural accuracy, cutting through wings before they could close distance. The void became a graveyard of debris as fire after fire died out against the Terran shield. Inside the dreadnought, the Terran crew worked with calm discipline. Their captain, a man with steel-gray eyes and a quiet voice, stood at the command table. He did not shout or curse, only gave simple orders in a tone that carried unshakable control. Maintain shield integrity. Prioritize civilian protection. Do not waste ammunition on targets that break formation. Precision only. His crew obeyed without hesitation. This was not their first war, and they fought not with pride but with duty. On the rebel world, commanders watched in awe. General Arvak whispered what many dared not say aloud. They fight to protect us, not themselves. He had seen empires come and go, conquerors that bled worlds dry. But this human vessel placed itself between the planet and the empire, using its bulk as a shield while carefully choosing every strike. It did not chase easy kills. It did not seek glory. It fought like a wall, unmovable and absolute. The Zorathian admiral refused to yield. He poured more ships into the fray, ordering entire wings to ram if necessary. His pride was on the line. But as each wave broke against the Terran defense, his fury turned to unease. The human ship should have been overwhelmed, yet every maneuver the admiral tried was anticipated and countered. Fighters lost cohesion, missile strikes were blunted, and his fleet began to scatter under pressure. Whispers spread across Zorathian comm channels. Pilots asked if they were truly facing humans. Some remembered ancient warnings told by their elders, warnings that spoke of a predator species that fought with patience and precision, a race that did not come to conquer but to endure, to strike only when certain. Those tales had been dismissed as myth, yet here they were made flesh in the black hull of the dreadnought. Then the voice returned, broadcast across all open frequencies, clear and steady. This is your final chance. Ceasefire. Evacuate your civilians. No more blood need be spilled today. The admiral snarled at the calmness, at the arrogance, but in the depths of his chest he felt something he had not known in decades: doubt. His invincible fleet was losing its rhythm, and the galaxy's forgotten predators had just revealed they were very much alive. The human way of war. The battle shifted into a strange rhythm as the Terran dreadnought held its ground against the vast Zorathian fleet. Where other powers in the galaxy would have fought with desperate fire or reckless charges, the human vessel fought with calm intention. Every move seemed measured, every shot chosen with purpose. The ship did not chase fleeing fighters or crippled cruisers, but instead placed itself between the rebel planet and the enemy guns. It moved like a shield more than a sword, sliding its massive frame across orbital paths to block artillery fire. The rebels watching from their bunkers saw this, and understood something deeper than the flashes of war. The humans were not here to show power alone, they were here to protect. The Zorathian commanders were not used to such restraint. Their enemies in past campaigns always fought for survival, clawing with whatever weapons they had, trying to strike back even in hopeless odds. This Terran ship did not act out of panic but out of confidence. Its gunners fired only when certain, cutting engines from enemy destroyers instead of detonating reactors, disabling ships rather than destroying them outright. In one engagement, a Zorathian frigate attempted a suicide run. The dreadnought did not vaporize it. Instead, it deployed a cluster of boarding drones that latched onto the hull, cut through the plating, and disabled the power systems within minutes. The frigate drifted helplessly, its crew taken captive but alive. On the rebel world, astonishment spread. Children in shelters heard the news through static-filled radios, and their fear began to turn into something they had never felt before: pride. The stories of humanity had always been half legend, whispers of a people who had fought wars in silence and then vanished. To see such a story unfold before their eyes filled them with a strange strength. General Arvak stood before his commanders and admitted in a quiet voice that he felt shame. Shame that his people had given up so easily while outsiders risked everything to protect them. Yet that shame became fuel, a burning desire to rise again. On the Zorathian flagship, Admiral Kleros raged at the growing collapse of his perfect formation. He barked orders to isolate the human vessel, but no matter how he shifted his ships, the dreadnought moved with cold precision, breaking his lines into scattered fragments. Every time he tried to pin it down, the Terran captain had already moved to another position like a predator circling wounded prey. The admiral realized with dread that this was not improvisation. This was doctrine. The humans had trained for centuries in tactics the Empire had never considered. Tactics built not on overwhelming numbers but on patience, timing, and the ability to read opponents like open books. Within the Terran ship, the crew fought in silence, each station manned by veterans who worked as though the battle were nothing more than a drill. Medics tended to the wounded with calm efficiency. Engineers rerouted power with steady hands, their faces streaked with sweat but their voices steady. The captain remained composed, his gaze fixed on the enemy lines. He was not a man of boasts. He spoke rarely, only to give instructions or remind his crew of their purpose. His command carried weight not through volume but through certainty, and his certainty was contagious. As more enemy ships fell into disarray, the dreadnought opened its hangars and released recovery shuttles. These small craft darted into the debris fields, pulling survivors from broken vessels, Zorathian and rebel alike. The galaxy had never seen such behavior. Mercy was not a tactic of war, not in the Empire's long history. To show mercy was to show weakness, yet the humans did it openly, as if daring the Zorathians to see compassion as a form of power. Rebel civilians watching the feeds could scarcely believe it. Images of captured enemy crews being treated with medical care spread quickly across underground networks. The Empire had always promised its subjects that humans were extinct or irrelevant, that their myths were nothing but stories. Now the truth was plain. Not only had humanity returned, but they carried with them a way of war that broke every rule of Empire, a way of war that valued protection over slaughter and strategy over arrogance. Still, the battle was far from over. The Zorathian admiral clenched his fists, his pride wounded deeper than his fleet. He would not allow one Terran ship to destroy centuries of fear built into his empire's name. He summoned his officers and revealed a weapon he had held in reserve, a device meant only for the most desperate of moments. A gravity lance, capable of twisting even the strongest hulls into molten wreckage. He ordered it prepared, his voice trembling not with fear but with obsession. If he could not break the Terrans with fire and steel, he would shatter them with the pull of stars themselves. The stage was set. The dreadnought continued its calm dance, holding the line and protecting the weak. The rebels began to rise from despair into defiance, and in the heart of the Empire's flagship, a weapon of monstrous power hummed to life, promising to test whether the human way of war could withstand the fury of gods, breaking the myth of invincibility. The Zorathian flagship vibrated with the hum of power as the gravity lance came online, its coils glowing with the light of compressed energy. Admiral Klyros stood tall in the center of his command deck, his claws gripping the rail as his eyes locked on the Terran dreadnought. He had been humiliated enough, watching his fleet scatter and break against a single ship, and his pride could not allow this battle to end without proving that the Empire was still untouchable. His officers shifted uneasily, for even they knew the gravity lance was unstable and could just as easily consume its wielder as its target. But none dared question him. Out in the black, the Terran dreadnought still moved with deliberate calm, sliding into position between the rebel world and the broken enemy wings. It continued to fire in measured bursts, disabling weapons, crippling engines, and pulling drifting survivors into the safety of its recovery nets. The human captain knew the Zorathians had not yet shown all their teeth, and his eyes narrowed, as his tactical officer reported a spike in gravimetric readings from the flagship. He had seen weapons like this before, on forgotten battlefields beyond the rim, and he knew what they could do. The gravity lance fired. Space itself twisted into a shuddering ripple, invisible currents tearing toward the human vessel. The dreadnought's hull screamed under the strain as its plates groaned and warped. Bulkheads buckled, lights flickered, and alarms howled across the decks. Crew members staggered as the artificial gravity inside the ship spasmed, throwing them against walls and floors. A lesser vessel would have been torn apart in seconds, ripped into molten fragments by the violent pull. But the Terran dreadnought held. Deep within its armored core, systems designed for far older wars engaged. Counter-gravity fields surged to life, bending space around the hull and forcing the ripple of the lance back along its path. The weapon strained against itself, caught between the unstoppable push of the Empire and the immovable resistance of human engineering. For a moment the void glowed with blue fire as the energies collided. Then the gravity lance array shuddered and cracked, explosions racing down its coils. On the flagship bridge, officers screamed as fire tore across their control pits. Klyros staggered, his crest trembling with disbelief. His great weapon, the secret ace that no foe could endure, had broken under the pressure of a single human ship. The Terran dreadnought seized the opening. Engines roared, and the massive vessel cut into the heart of the enemy formation, breaking their command net with cold precision. Its cannons thundered, not in wild barrages but in surgical strikes, carving through communications relays and severing fleet coordination. Zorathian destroyers drifted without orders, their captains panicking as isolation set in. Squadrons that once moved in flawless formation now scattered like prey animals before a predator. The myth of invincibility cracked with each passing second. Rebels on the planet cheered as the feeds lit up with images of Zorathian ships fleeing in disarray. Children who had been prepared for death now clutched their parents' hands and shouted the name Terran with joy. In the bunkers, commanders wept openly, their belief in defeat erased by the sight of one ship turning back an empire. Hope was no longer a whisper but a roar that filled every heart. But not all of the Zorathian captains surrendered to fear. Some, consumed by pride or desperation, prepared to ram their ships into the dreadnought, hoping to sacrifice themselves for even a chance to damage it. Others refused to accept the humiliation of surrender and ordered their weapons to fire blindly into the chaos. The void burned with reckless defiance, but each attempt was crushed by the calm and ruthless efficiency of the human crew. On the Terran bridge, the captain stood silent, his hands clasped behind his back as he watched the enemy lines collapse. His crew knew the danger was far from over, for desperation could drive even the proudest fleet to acts of madness. He gave his orders quietly, directing his gunners to focus on disabling ramming ships while leaving avenues of retreat open for those who wished to flee. The message was clear. The Terrans did not fight to slaughter but to prove a truth the galaxy had forgotten. Admiral Klyros sank into his chair, his mind spinning with disbelief. His fleet, his empire, his pride, all broken by a single ship that should not even exist in their time. He tried to convince himself that this was an illusion, that the Terrans had returned only to die as all challengers must. Yet as he stared at the dreadnought carving through his armada, the truth clawed at his heart. The humans were not myths, they were predators, ancient and patient, and their return meant the age of Zorathian dominance was crumbling. The myth of invincibility was shattered. What remained was the fury of an empire unwilling to yield, and Klyros swore that if his fleet could not destroy the humans, he would pay any price to drag them into the flames with him. Price of mercy, the battlefield was littered with burning wrecks and drifting escape pods as the Terran dreadnought continued its silent vigil above Keranos. The Zorathian fleet was broken but not yet gone, and their scattered forces still lashed out in fits of fury. Many enemy crews abandoned ship as their commanders lost control, ejecting into the void in fragile lifeboats. The human captain gave his order without hesitation. Deploy recovery shuttles. Bring them aboard. His crew moved instantly, dispatching rescue craft into the dangerous debris fields, weaving between unstable hulks and detonating fuel cells to pull survivors out alive. To the rebels watching, it was an act beyond comprehension. The Empire had never spared enemies, never shown compassion, yet these humans risked their lives to save even the same soldiers who had come to kill them. On the rebel surface shelters, civilians crowded around flickering screens as images came through of Terran medics working on Zorathian wounded. A mother whispered that she had never believed such a thing possible. A child asked if the humans were angels. For the first time in living memory, mercy was seen not as weakness, but as strength. The people of Keranos began to raise their voices, in defiance against despair, telling one another that they too must be worthy of such protection. But mercy came at a price. As recovery shuttles ferried survivors, a damaged Zorathian destroyer fired one last desperate barrage. Several heavy rounds struck the dreadnought broadside, piercing outer hull sections and detonating along a corridor. Alarms screamed through the ship as fires erupted. Sections of the deck blew open to the void, dragging crew into the dark before emergency barriers sealed the gaps. The great vessel shuddered under the impact, and deep inside its engineering core, a reactor conduit burst into flame. Engineers raced into the smoke-filled chamber. One of them, a young woman with grease across her face, refused to retreat even as fire consumed the deck plating. She clamped her arms around the ruptured conduit and worked with trembling hands to stabilize the line. Her comrades pulled at her, begging her to leave, but she shouted that if she let go, the entire power grid would fail. She held fast until the last bolt was secured, her body shaking with exhaustion, and only then did she collapse into their arms. Her sacrifice was one of many across the wounded ship. Medics sprinted through darkened corridors carrying stretchers while the wounded groaned. A lieutenant with a broken leg ordered his men to keep fighting before finally allowing himself to be sedated. Smoke stung the air. Lights flickered, but still the dreadnought fought on. Its crew moved with determination, each member knowing they carried not only the survival of their ship, but also the hope of an entire world below them. The rebel commanders watched in silence. General Arvak clenched his fists, tears burning his eyes. He had fought all his life believing that mercy was a luxury no warrior could afford, that to protect one's people required brutality. Yet here was a ship bleeding for strangers, risking everything not to destroy but to save. He turned to his officers and said that they could no longer remain passive. If humanity would risk its blood for them, then the rebels would rise again no matter the cost. In orbit, the Terran dreadnought reoriented itself, thrusters firing to push its damaged hull back into protective orbit around Karanos. Smoke still curled from its side, and whole compartments were sealed off and silent. Yet its guns turned once more to face the remnants of the Zorathian fleet. On the flagship, Admiral Klyros saw the damage inflicted and seized on it with savage joy. "They bleed," he snarled. "They can be broken." He rallied what forces remained, preparing a last desperate charge to bring the Terrans down. Inside the dreadnought, the captain stood steady at his command post. He saw the faces of his crew, soot-streaked and weary, yet unshaken. He saw reports of casualties scrolling across his console. He heard the cries of wounded echoing through the lower decks. He knew the price his people had paid for their mercy, but still he gave his order. "Hold the line. Protect the civilians." "We do not yield." His voice was calm, and his crew answered with a single word spoken as one. "Aye." The battle was not yet won. The Empire would not let its pride be shattered without a final storm, and the Terran dreadnought, though wounded, stood ready to pay the price of mercy, to show the galaxy that humanity had returned not only with power, but with purpose. Duel at close range. The Zorathian fleet gathered its fractured remnants into one last formation, a wall of steel and fire drawn tight around the flagship. Admiral Klyros, his pride torn but not yet destroyed, ordered his surviving captains to prepare for a final charge. He knew that the myth of invincibility had already been broken, but if he could bring the Terran dreadnought down with him, the galaxy would still tremble before his name. His voice, sharp and commanding, rang through the comms as he declared that no captain was to retreat, no crew was to abandon their ship. They would either destroy the Terrans or burn with honor in the attempt. The Zorathians, bound by loyalty and fear, obeyed without question. In the void above Karanos, the rebel civilians saw the gathering storm and felt their hearts freeze. The Terran dreadnought, scarred and wounded from earlier strikes, floated like a great wall before the planet. Its hull still glowed faintly from the wounds of battle, fires flickering behind sealed plating, yet its guns moved with precision, ready to meet the charge. The human captain stood at his station, his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes unwavering. He did not need to give speeches, for his crew already knew what was at stake. They would either hold and protect Karanos or fall and leave the world to its fate. The Zorathian admiral gave the order. Engines roared as destroyers, cruisers, and gunboats surged forward in a tight phalanx, weapons blazing. The void erupted with streams of plasma and lances of energy. The Terran dreadnought answered, its cannons thundering in measured rhythm. Explosions blossomed across the black, and the clash at long range turned swiftly into a collision of giants. Zorathian ships rammed forward without care for survival, driving themselves into close quarters where their numbers might overwhelm even the mighty human vessel. The dreadnought did not flinch. It fired thrusters in a silent burn, angling its massive frame directly into the oncoming wall. The two forces collided in the emptiness of space, and what followed was not the distant duel of fleets but the brutal clash of warriors at arm's length. Hulls scraped against hulls, tearing metal from metal. Cannons fired point blank, shredding armor and spilling wreckage into the void. The dreadnought's shields flared white under the constant storm, threatening to collapse, yet its engines pushed it deeper into the Zorathian line, breaking formation with raw will. Boarding pods erupted from the dreadnought's sides, punching through weakened enemy ships. Terran Marines in armored suits stormed into corridors thick with smoke, moving with silent precision. They fought not like berserkers, but like disciplined hunters, advancing in pairs, clearing room by room, disabling reactors before crews could overload them. Zorathian soldiers resisted with desperation, claws and blades clashing against steel and rifles. Blood floated in the air in crimson and black globes, drifting in low gravity as screams echoed through the metal halls. One Zorathian captain, refusing to surrender, attempted to detonate his ship's core, determined to drag the Terrans into death with him. But the Marines reached the control chamber in time, cutting through his guards and disarming the sequence with seconds to spare. The human sergeant who led the charge looked down at the fallen alien and spoke in a voice without hatred. "You are beaten. Lay down your arms." The captain spat in defiance, but his crew, seeing the hopelessness of their situation, surrendered one by one. Back outside, the battle turned into chaos. The Terran dreadnought's guns tore through enemy vessels at close range, each shot blasting apart armor that once seemed unbreakable. Yet the cost was high. Another salvo struck the dreadnought's flank, rupturing compartments and killing dozens. Still the ship fought on, smoke pouring from its wounds, its crew refusing to abandon their posts. Medics dragged the injured from the fire, engineers patched breaches with bare hands and molten steel, and gunners loaded cannons even as explosions shook the deck beneath their feet. On the flagship, Admiral Klyros watched with fury and despair. His fleet was collapsing around him, his captains surrendering or falling silent, their ships torn apart by relentless Terran fire. His pride, his legacy, everything he had built was crumbling. In a final act of rage, he gave the order to detonate the flagship's magazine, intending to annihilate both himself and the human ship in one last inferno. His officers recoiled in horror, begging him to reconsider, but he silenced them with a glare. If the Empire could not have victory, it would have revenge. The order raced through the flagship systems, igniting warning klaxons as the detonation sequence began. Across the battlefield, the Terran sensors caught the signal. The captain of the dreadnought knew instantly what the Admiral intended. He turned to his boarding teams with a single command. "Stop him." Terran Marines, already cutting their way through the flagship's corridors, surged toward the core where the detonation codes were primed. Their boots slammed against steel, rifles ready, determination burning in their eyes. The duel at close. Range was no longer just a clash of ships, but a race against time. The dreadnought's survival and the lives of every soul on Karanos now depended on whether the Terrans could prevent the Mad Admiral from turning his pride into a weapon of annihilation. The choice that changes the war. The corridors of the Zorathian flagship shook as the self-destruct sequence raced toward completion. Red warning lights pulsed along the walls, and the air was filled with the sound of klaxons and panicked shouts from the crew. Admiral Klyros stood in the command chamber, his hands gripping the armrests of his chair, his crest raised high with fury. If his fleet could not destroy the Terran dreadnought, then at least his sacrifice would. His officers stared at him in disbelief, torn between loyalty and fear. Some begged him to stop, others fled toward escape pods, but his mind was set. His pride would not allow him to live in a galaxy where Zorathian supremacy was broken. Deep within the ship, Terran Marines charged through the narrow halls, their boots hammering against the deck as they followed the pulsing lights toward the core. Gunfire cracked around them as Zorathian defenders tried to block their advance, but the humans pushed forward without hesitation. Every second mattered. A sergeant at the front raised his rifle and cut down a barricade before shouting to his squad to press on. They knew that if they failed, the flagship would detonate, and the shockwave would consume not only the dreadnought, but also the rebel world below. On the Terran ship, the captain stood in silence, watching the timer flicker on his display. His officers looked to him for reassurance, but he gave none. Instead, he spoke a simple truth. They will succeed. Trust them. His voice carried across the bridge, steady and calm, anchoring his weary crew. Even as damage reports flooded, and even as fires still raged in wounded sections, his faith in his people never faltered. The Marines reached the core chamber with seconds to spare. The door was sealed, reinforced with thick plating. Explosives were planted, and with a thunderous blast, the entrance was torn open. Smoke and sparks filled the air as the humans stormed inside. Admiral Klyros stood by the control console, his claws dancing over the final sequence. He turned as the Marines entered, his eyes blazing with hatred. "You will not take this victory from me," he roared. He drew his blade, curved and jagged, and hurled himself forward in one last act of defiance. The fight was brief but savage. Blades clashed against armored gauntlets. Rifles cracked at close range, and the chamber rang with the fury of a desperate leader unwilling to yield. Klyros fought with the strength of desperation, but the Terrans moved with precision. Every strike calculated, every block measured. In the end, it was not rage that triumphed, but discipline. The Admiral was disarmed and forced to his knees, his blade clattering across the floor. The sequence was halted, the detonation cancelled. Silence fell in the chamber, broken only by the hiss of cooling machinery. The flagship was secured. Across the battlefield, Zorathian ships, leaderless and broken, ceased fire. Some powered down their weapons, others sent surrender signals, and many simply fled into the void. The Terran dreadnought, though battered and scarred, broadcast a wideband message across every channel. The human captain appeared on the screens, his face calm and his voice unshaken. "The battle is over. Surrender your arms and you will be spared. Civilians will be protected, war criminals will face judgment, but no innocents will suffer. Those who lay down their weapons will live." On Karanos, cheers erupted. Civilians poured from shelters, their voices rising in joy and disbelief. The rebel commanders wept openly, their despair finally replaced by hope. They watched the Zorathian crews surrender and could scarcely believe it. For generations they had lived under the shadow of invincible conquerors, and now that shadow had been pierced by a single Terran ship and the resolve of its crew. On the flagship, Admiral Klyros knelt in silence, his chest heaving. He looked at the humans around him, their weapons steady, their eyes hard yet not cruel. He expected execution, humiliation, the cruelty that the Empire would have delivered in his place. Instead, the Terran sergeant spoke only one sentence: "You will answer for your crimes, but you will live." That mercy cut deeper than any blade. Klyros realized that the empire he had built on fear had already lost. As the dust settled and the fires dimmed, the galaxy trembled with the news. The unbreakable empire had been broken. The myth of Zorathian supremacy had fallen, and the name of humanity, long forgotten, now spread once more among the stars. They were not conquerors but guardians, not tyrants but protectors, and their return would change the course of every world. Above Karanos, the Terran dreadnought drifted in orbit, scarred but standing. Its crew mourned their dead, healed their wounded, and prepared for whatever would come next. They had proven that mercy was not weakness, that strength could be wielded with purpose, and that even the most invincible empire could be humbled. And as the stars burned bright around them, the galaxy learned a new law. Do not mistake the kindness of humanity for frailty, for when they fight to the end. Humanity's dawn. Across the stars, the galaxy had changed in ways no historian could have predicted. Ships that once ruled without question now floated in silence, as crews surrendered one by one, and the worlds that had trembled for centuries now breathed freely, and the Terran dreadnought drifted among them, its hull scarred yet unbowed, a symbol of what humans could do when they refused to yield. The captain stood on the bridge, his gaze sweeping over the stars, each light a reminder of planets, saved civilizations preserved and futures reclaimed. Every crew member knew the cost of this victory, the lives lost, the battles endured, yet none regretted a single choice. For they had reminded the universe that humanity was neither fragile nor insignificant, and the same courage that had driven them to survive now promised a new era of hope. On Karanos, citizens poured into the streets embracing each other, some weeping, others laughing at the sheer impossibility of their freedom. They looked up at the orbiting dreadnought and saw not a warship but a guardian, a protector that had arrived when all hope seemed lost, and far from the cheers the surviving Zorathians were being escorted from the planet. Their weapons confiscated their pride, broken yet alive, and the humans showed them mercy, not because it was weakness but because strength without control was meaningless. And the message echoed across every system: surrendering enemies would live, innocence would be spared, and humanity had returned not as conquerors but as judges and guides, a force that demanded respect but tempered it with compassion. The captain gathered his officers in the command chamber. The lights dimmed and the hum of the engines filled the space with a steady heartbeat. He spoke of rebuilding alliances, of ensuring peace across contested systems, of preparing for threats that would surely come in time. Yet every word carried the certainty that humanity had earned its place among the stars, that their presence was no longer a whisper in the dark, but a herald of change, that even the mightiest fleets must reckon with a species that fought with brains, strength, and a sense of justice unmatched by any known civilization. And beyond the metal hull of the dreadnought, humans looked toward distant suns, imagining worlds untouched, imagining life thriving under protection, imagining a galaxy that finally understood that to underestimate humans was to invite your own downfall. In the aftermath of the battle, stories spread from planet to planet, legends of how a single Terran battleship had shifted the balance of power, of how disciplined soldiers had faced impossible odds and survived, and how mercy had been wielded like a blade sharper than any sword. And across the systems, fear was replaced by respect and awe and hope, and children born now would grow, knowing the tales of courage and resilience, that humanity could rise when everything was against them, and civilizations that had suffered under tyranny would see that resistance was possible, that strength with purpose was unstoppable, and even the former conquerors could not deny the lesson written in the stars, that humanity was here and would endure. As the dreadnought prepared to leave orbit, its engines flaring against the dark canvas of space, the crew felt a quiet pride in what they had accomplished. They knew the galaxy would remember this day, not as the day a war ended, but as the dawn of a new era where humans walked among the stars and no being would dare challenge them again. And somewhere in the silence of space, the captain allowed himself a rare smile, for they had not just survived, they had prevailed, and the light of humanity shone brighter than any fleet ever could. And as the stars stretched endlessly before them, the galaxy whispered the truth that no one could deny: the end